the problem was, one, my parents had loved me, but love did not, I learned that love didn't mean that you couldn't get abandoned. Love wasn't strong enough. And the second thing I learned, which was the way I internalized, it wasn't true, but that's how my heart understood it, because I couldn't believe that my father, whom I adored, could possibly have done anything wrong. So something must have been wrong with me. And so I came to the conclusion that if you really got to know me, then you would realize I was abandonable at my very core.
Tessa, welcome to the happy hour.
It's so fun to be with you, Jamie.
I'm so excited to have you, and especially because you are our second guest of the summer for our Encounter series, where we really just want to share people's stories of having an encounter with Jesus. And Tessa, what I've seen after doing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews over the years, and then specifically interviews about people's story, is that God is just the God who is unique, and he works in our lives in ways that are just so special for us as individuals. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing your story. Before we get to your story, tell everybody what you do now. Like, tell what you do in life, all those things.
I am a very blessed wife, and I'm a full-time writer. I write historical fiction set in the time of the Bible, and I also do a little bit of nonfiction.
You have a book coming out this year, don't you?
Yep, I have another book coming out in the fall. So it's just really one of those dreams that came to pass for me, because as you can tell, as I'm speaking, like, English is not my first language. I have a funny accent. So to be able to be a writer full-time, I speak sometimes as well, that the Lord restored that to me, even though this is not the language of my birth. It's really miraculous.
It is miraculous. And I was looking at your books a couple days ago online, and I realized these are the kind of books that my mom loves. And so I'm going to have to send her some of your copies, some of your books. So I was like, oh, this is so exciting. So I can't wait to read your books as well. Well, I would like to go back in time, if you could take us to Tessa growing up as a child. What did that look like? And pre-knowing Jesus, all the things, but tell us a little bit about your childhood.
So I was born in the Middle East. I'm not going to mention the country just for security reasons, but just I'll give you a hint. I was born in the land of Cyrus and Esther and Nehemiah. My parents were nominal Muslims. So in case you're wondering what is a nominal Muslim, it's actually not that different from a nominal Christian. So my parents believed in God, but they didn't practice the tenets of Islam. My mother didn't wear hijab. They didn't pray 5 times a day. They didn't fast during Ramadan, those kinds of things. And what I recall is that they really didn't believe in any kind of religion at all. They sort of felt like all religions were exactly the same. They're made by human minds, and it's like, if you need that crutch, that's fine for you, but we are kind of above that. We are moral enough, thank you very much. Sort of that's where we landed in terms of our faith. And
I have a question about that with the
Yeah.
nominal Muslim. Again, not knowing, and it's not important what exact country, but in the Middle East, is it okay to be a nominal Muslim, or is there a push for people to be like all bought in to the religion?
That's a
Like,
great
did your
question.
parents have any pushback for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, this was during the time of the Shah, and so no, it was very normal for people who were kind of educated and had white collar jobs. Let's put it that way. Many of them were nominal Muslims. There was no pushback. It was just the way you lived. Life has changed a lot, not in the sense that people are nominal Muslims. There's still a lot of people who are nominal Muslims. It's just that they have to keep it down low. They can't announce it. Women try, for example, to go out now without hijab, and they are punished for it horribly. So
Yeah. Okay, so you grew up in a nominal Muslim family. Your parents were just like, there is a God and everyone can have their own thing, and everything was good until what?
Then when I was 13, my parents were divorced, and my mom and my sister and I ended up moving to England, where I started attending boarding school for girls. Now, I said that in a really fast sentence, but it entailed a lot of loss for me, because it meant I pretty much left behind the life I knew. I lost my home. I lost my friends. I lost my extended family, which in the Middle East is a big part of life.
Mm-hmm.
I lost my food. I lost my language. But probably I think the biggest loss in all of that was my father, because my father was a physician and he decided to remain behind so that he could practice.
Mm-hmm.
And, my dad was the parent that I connected with emotionally. I always knew my parents loved me. Like, this was something that was very overt in our family. It was expressed verbally. My mom was a big hugger. But you can really love your kids but not get them. And I think my mom
Mm-hmm.
didn't know quite what to do with me. I was very kind of a sensitive child. I wrote poetry. I cried at the drop of a hat, and I was really strong-willed. So she was the parent who had charge of us on a daily basis, because my dad was always working. But my dad
Mm-hmm.
was the one that I felt emotionally understood me and connected with
Mm.
me. So leaving him behind, that was a huge wound. That was a huge
Yeah.
loss.
Oh, I can imagine at 14, like not only having to leave everything about basically your identity. I mean, your whole identity, you left it in your home country and ended up in England, which is can be quite different from your home country in a lot of ways. And leaving your dad. Talk about that transition a little bit as a teenager. I mean, I have a 15-year-old daughter, and like even just sometimes having to do her chores is like an identity struggle for her. Like, but you're picking up and leaving. What did that do for you as a teenager?
I mean, in some ways, it was good for me because I'd been very cosseted, and to be now
Mm-hmm.
in this very highly disciplined place, while it kind of ripped a layer of skin off me, was probably in the long run something that I needed. But I think the most damaging part was this separation from my dad, because this is back when the only way we could there's no FaceTime, there's no
Right.
texting. The only way we could communicate was like longhand letters with
Mm.
stamps that you had to lick in order to put on the
Right,
envelope.
right.
And then phone calls, which were so expensive that we could only do it really once a month or a couple of times a month. And so that separation, I had to make sense of that somehow. And I knew at 14, because in 14, life is very black and white. You
Mm-hmm.
kind of understand life in a very um, right or wrong way. And I knew in my heart of hearts that the father that I adored had made the decision to part himself from me. Yeah, he had like some common sense reason for doing it, but I also was aware that if he had wanted to give everything up,
Mm.
if he had wanted to make life smaller and simpler, he could have been with me. And he chose not to be. And
Mm.
I couldn't internalize that, because I would have given up anything to be with him. Later on, that's exactly what Jesus did for us. Jesus
Mm.
gave up the glory. Jesus gave up home. Jesus gave up his father. Jesus gave up the perfection and emptied himself into the womb of Mary in order to be with
Mm.
us, in order to make it possible for us to always be with him. That's exactly like the wound that had been carved into my heart. I
Mm.
knew that's how fathers love. But my
Mm.
father made a decision that sort of brought a wound of forsakenness into my heart. So I
I
had the
have a
father wound.
feeling later in your story, Tess, I have a feeling that this is going to come back to play a little bit
You bet.
with that wound. There you go.
So, but at the time, this was like it wasn't a Christian boarding school, but we were told that we had to go to church on Sundays, because English boarding schools are very traditional. So that's what you do on Sundays. But they told those of us who were from a different background, you can sit upstairs in your balcony and read your own books of faith, which of course for us would have been the Quran. But what they didn't
Mm-hmm.
understand is that the Quran is really different from the way the Bible operates. First of all, it's not one of the tenets of faith. It's for us Christians, reading the Bible, it's a really key way of connecting with God, of deepening our faith. But the Quran doesn't have that function.
Mm.
And then for us, it's so important that people read it in their heart language. Like, people give up their lives to go live in a different country, learn that language, and translate the Bible into their heart language. But the
Mm-hmm.
Quran, you only can read in the original Arabic in order for it to be efficacious from a faith perspective. So
Mm-hmm.
I didn't speak Arabic. I spoke Persian. But I was too shy to explain to my teachers, hey, like this
Uh-huh.
doesn't make any sense. So I didn't want to be disobedient. So I said, well, I'll read romance novels.
You're like, I'm going to make use of my time up here, and I may not be able to read this, but I can read romance novels. I love it.
Exactly. Well, I learned about love, but I'm not sure that's what Jesus had in mind. But so
Uh-huh.
all that to say, I did not become a Christian while I was going to school, and in fact never heard the gospel. And even until I graduated. I came to the US to go to college. This has been my home ever since. I'm an American citizen, and I just, as an aside, I love this country. I'm so blessed to live here. And I
Mm-hmm.
think sometimes, we forget that.
Yeah.
But there's just, I'm not saying we're perfect, but I'm saying in the
Mm-hmm.
midst of our imperfection, in the midst of all the things that are broken, there's so much favor from the Lord that still rests on this country.
Mm-hmm.
So, but even in all of those years that I was going to college and all that, nobody shared the gospel. So I'm definitely not a Christian at this point.
Okay. So you move over and go to college. Can you say where you went to college?
I went to college upstate New York, a women's college at the time was
Okay.
called the Sage College. Yeah.
Okay. So you come to you come to university over here. You leave your mother behind and your sister behind. And at this point, I would say that you are you learn English at your boarding school, I would assume. Yes, and then you come to university but no one ever introduced you to Jesus. And so let's talk about how that journey started from you from coming to the US and then having an encounter with the Lord.
Well, it came through heartbreak, really. I fell in love when I was in college, and I married a young man. And all those losses that I'd had as a teenager, I sort of sank into this man. So he became my home. He became my
Mm,
family. He became my stability. And no one can carry that weight. And he certainly couldn't. And after a few years, he wanted a divorce. He sort of felt like he wanted to be with other people. And so
mm,
here's where the Muslim worldview came into work for me, because in Islam, even though we weren't practicing Islam, we lived in that worldview. And in Islam, everything is very achievement oriented. Even your eternal destiny has to
mm-hmm.
do with you. So by the end of your life, literally, there's a scale. Your good works go on one side, your bad works go on the other. Whichever is heavier, that's the direction you're headed in.
Yeah.
So I kind of grew up with this notion that it's up to me. Life is up to me.
Mm,
Happiness is up to me. Contentment is something I carve out. And I was under the impression that if I worked hard enough, if I was pretty enough, if I was smart enough, if I was enough in some way, that would mean that I would be, um, that I could achieve success, and success meaning
yeah.
like happiness and contentment. And
Mm-hmm.
here I came across this situation where there was nothing I could do to change my husband's mind. He was done.
Mm,
And so, and all of a sudden, all of these lies I had believed about life fell apart. And
mm,
that place of security that I had also rested myself on fell apart. And
mm,
worse than that, when my parents had gotten divorced, it had been so painful to me, Jamie, that I had made a vow that even if I married the devil himself, I would
mm,
never get divorced. And
mm-hmm.
you've got to watch these vows because they have such power, whether they are intentional or subconscious or whatever, they have such power over you. And
Mm,
for me, that vow meant essentially that divorce was the greatest failure. So
mm,
now, not only could I not change anything, not only had I lost whatever foundation of security and happiness I had, but I was also
mm,
this great failure. I had
mm.
failed
And
at life.
you probably were feeling all the feelings of that abandonment at 14 again. Like you couldn't make your dad stay and choose you. You couldn't make him love you. And now you're in a situation where you can't make your husband stay and you can't make him love you. And so, I find it interesting, Tessa, and we see this in Western cultures where with Christianity, is that this nominal faith that you had, it still was so foundational for you. I mean, like you weren't bought in, you weren't a practicing Muslim, but it was dictating everything about your life, which I think is interesting so much. Were you aware of that in that moment of like, or was it just this is our culture? It was more culture, I bet.
Yeah, I think I didn't even understand that it was culture. I just felt like this is the truth. I didn't understand
Okay.
how much of this was weighed in by these external forces. And so this rejection, this wound of rejection, I'd been abandoned, now I was rejected. It just went to the core of me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, I had never heard the gospel, so I didn't have a place to go to with this. And again, in Islam, everything is, because everything's up to you, the notion of God is called kind and merciful, but there is no really sign of that mercy. You don't see it at work. You don't see it on the cross. Where for us Christians, everything comes down to grace. It's not up to you. In fact, what you learn, the first thing you learn about yourself in Christianity is you will fail, you have failed. And there is no way that you can escape that failure. But God himself has made a way. That's the grace. And I had no access to any of that at the time. So that was a time I had gone back to England for a year just to be with my mom, because I didn't know what to do with myself. And that's when I had a dream of Jesus. In that dream, I was by the Sea of Galilee, and a man started walking toward me, and I knew in the dream that this man is Jesus. And I was very curious to see, well, what does he look like? And I'm embarrassed to say I'm probably one of the few people in the world who was so superficial in my awake life, and I took that superficiality with me into my dream world.
I don't think you're alone in that, Tessa, so don't put that on you.
So when I saw Jesus, my first impression was disappointment, because the only way I'd seen Jesus was in a couple of movies when I was in England during Easter and Christmas. And in both movies, he'd been really like Hollywood good looking. And the Jesus of my dream was not. He was like homely. And I was like, that's Jesus? God couldn't do any better for his son. And then he walked close enough to me in the dream where I could see his eyes. And, all of that superficiality left me. And I almost fell to my knees, Jamie, because in his eyes, I saw the kind of love I had always dreamed of. It was the love that would never fail, the love that would never break. It was the love that had come into this world pursuing me. And next to that love, I also saw a power, the likes of which I had never known. Later on, I would recognize this is the power that put the stars in their place, that named them, that holds the world in the palm of his hand. But of course, I didn't know any of that. I just knew I'd never seen anything like these two things, that whatever this man said would come to pass, that every promise he made, I could stand on. And the miraculous part of this dream was that I knew he was the Son of God, that I knew he was very God of very God. And when he said, follow me, I knew he wasn't just saying, walk with me down to the Sea of Galilee and get into my boat, although we did that. He was saying, follow me for the rest of your life.
Okay, so I have read about these dreams and heard people talk about them, and I literally get chill bumps every time I hear, because I it's funny, Tessa, last week we had Joanne on the show talking about women who risk in the book and her work in the Middle East. And as I was reading the book, I keep telling everybody about this book. Like, I'm talking about it to everybody I tell, because everyone's got to read it. And I told someone, and you have it, which is so funny because someone just told you to read it. I love it. But as I was telling someone about it, Tessa, I told them, I said, it almost makes me cry, because I said, I wish I could understand what that feels like, that dream. And I've been walking with Jesus for over 2 decades. I grew up in a Christian home. Like, I knew who Jesus was from the time I was a child. But there's something about that is so intriguing and beautiful to me, that I'm jealous, not in a bad way, but in oh, I wish I could wake up from a dream knowing that you just saw Jesus. And so I'm so intrigued by it. And I want to ask you a question, because you mentioned this. You said the miraculous thing is that you knew that it was Jesus, the Son of God. Like, you knew that that's who it was. And so my 2 questions for you, and I don't even know if you have an answer to this. First is, growing up in a nominal Muslim household, going to church in England, coming to the U.S., what did you know about Jesus? That's my first question, because you said, I didn't really know. What did you know? And then my second question is, and again, I don't know if you have an answer for this because you said it was miraculous that you knew it was Jesus. Like, how do you explain? How did you know it was Jesus? Like, and again, I feel like I'm asking like the dumbest question ever because you're like, I don't know. It was just in my dream. But my two questions: what did you know about Jesus? And when you woke up, how did you know that was Jesus that I just saw?
Whatever I knew about Jesus was what I had seen in those two movies. So, I knew he had gone to the cross. I knew that there
So
was
you had
this.
seen like an Easter movie and a Christmas movie.
That's it. So
Okay.
that's the sum total of my knowledge, not my belief, but what I had seen. I did I did know that Jesus could heal while he was on earth, that sort of a thing. I will tell you, there's a verse in Philippians that says, "Every knee shall bow and every tongue confess." That's how I felt when I met him in the dream. Like
Mm,
I literally felt like my knees are going to give way and my tongue is confessing he's the Son of God. Like that's how it feels, just to sort of put your mind at ease in terms of like, oh man, you had this experience and I didn't. I did wake up with 3 days of unshakable peace, which at that time was extraordinary because my life had shattered.
yeah. Yeah.
But I didn't become a Christian.
Right.
Like my conscious mind still had all of those objections that I had since my childhood. I still thought, Jesus is a religion, all of that. That's for like other people. I don't need this.
Mm,
Um, I would like a list of do's and don'ts because my life is a mess, but like this whole thing is not for me.
mm,
But I knew something important had happened in my life because of the peace I was experiencing.
mhm,
And I also feel like in the spiritual realm, something happened that broke through some stronghold in my soul that I didn't know existed. Because after that is when, for the first time, I was surrounded by Christians. I had neighbors who were Christians. I had a friend of mine, when I came back to the US, I made a really good friend, and her parents were all like totally into Jesus. And these people now started loving up on me like crazy. They would invite me to their home, they would cook for me. They acted like they really enjoyed my company. They must have,
mhm.
because it's 30 some odd years later they still invite me to their home. And so, and I knew that there was something special about them, and I kept asking them, like, what is it about you? Like, the parents of my friend had such a good marriage, and they had no business having a good marriage because they were even more different than my parents had been different.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, why do you love each other? Like, it's clear you're happy. Where does this come from? And they kept saying Jesus. And I was like, yeah, okay. But besides that, can you
Tell
give
me
me,
for real. Yeah.
yeah, like tell me the list. What's the list?
Yeah.
And now they said, no, it's just Jesus. And so, for a few months this went on, and I one day I remember thinking, okay, 99%. I'm right, because I'm usually right, and they're wrong. But 1% or 0.1%, what if I'm wrong? What am I missing out here? And I
Mm,
always say it like, Jesus just needed my 0.1%. That's all he needed.
yeah. Yeah.
And that was the permission for him to come into my heart, and I fell in love with him. And really, that's what it is. It wasn't an intellectual, like the intellectual um, faith came afterwards.
Mhm.
The initial faith was a falling in love with the person of Jesus. Again,
Mm,
going back to that moment of looking in his eyes, there is no love like that.
mm, mm. I want to know, after you started this journey of falling in love with Jesus, and I really don't want people to miss how much of that was just people loving you like Jesus loves people, and like how much that goes into people's lives. And all of us that are listening, me, you, all of us, we have these opportunities all the time just to love people. And we never know if we're going to be the one person that's showing them like this love from Jesus. And although we don't have perfect love, obviously we're sinners, but to show them that. But I want to go back to, you started this whole conversation with your parents getting a divorce and really feeling as though your dad had a choice and he chose something other than his daughter. And now that you're falling in love with Jesus, what happens with your relationship with your father, and what happens to these wounds that you've been carrying for 20 some odd years, maybe? What does that look like?
Well, one of the things that happened that was extraordinary for me was that Jesus himself fathered me. It's sort of like the woman
Mm,
with the issue of blood. Right before her, this father comes and falls at Jesus' feet and says, come and heal my daughter. But she has to steal her healing because there's no father to fall at his feet for her. And so she's the only
mm,
woman the only place where Jesus looks at her and calls her daughter. And I think he calls her daughter because he steps into that lack, he steps into that vacuum. Whatever the father wound is, he calls her daughter. And what he's saying is,
Mm,
I'm your father. I will never abandon you. I will
mm,
cherish you. I'm proud
mm,
of you. I will protect you. I will provide for you. He calls her
mm,
daughter and he fulfills fatherhood. And Jesus did that for me little by little over the months and the years. He taught me what it was like to be father. When I say father today and I pray, to me, that's a miracle in my mouth. It's a
yeah.
miracle that the God of the universe, who's so other, is genuinely my
Mm-hmm.
father and loves me like that.
Mm,
I
mm,
never take that for granted, or I try never to take that for granted.
yeah.
And so number one, the thing that I learned was that God is not an abandoner. He says in the Bible, in Isaiah, he says you shall be called sought out, a city not forsaken. And those are all capitals because they're names. He says to his people who are in captivity, he says, I'm changing your name. And I
Mm,
learned that I was not the abandoned. I was the opposite. I was not
mm,
forsaken and I was sought out. So I
mm,
learned I was fathered in a very core place. And I understood as an adult that my father did the best he could. He's actually a very kind man and just really a profoundly dear person. And he came to live with us. He did give up everything to come and live with us in the end. And we had 20 years with him or so after that. But, I was an adult by then.
mm-hmm.
And the second thing was the rejection from my husband. That wound took longer. And I remember, one day I was saying, Lord, you've got to take this wound away from me because it keeps showing up in all sorts of places. And I had this picture. Sometimes I get pictures when I pray. And I had this picture. And there was a road that was just not paved. It was all made of dirt. And there was a ring that had fallen into the dirt. It was a diamond ring. And Jesus said, what do you see? And I said, it's a diamond ring. And it was like a nice big diamond. And he said, yeah, but people have stepped on it. I said, that's okay. He said, it's dirty. I said, I'll wash it. He said, it's dented. I said, I'll straighten it. It's gold. It's a diamond. It's still worth something. And there was this quiet moment. And then Jesus said, don't you see? You're my diamond.
Mm,
You're my jewel. If someone has thrown you not knowing your value, that was their loss. You never changed for me. You
mm,
always remained my precious jewel. And
mm,
where you are dirty, I'll wash you. Where you are dented, I'll fix you. I'll heal you. I'll restore you.
mm,
And finally, it dawned on me my value, my worth had never been taken. I had always been his jewel. And, I wrote that scene with a pearl in my first novel. And to this day, I still get letters from people around the world because it's been translated into, I don't know, a bunch of languages. So it doesn't matter where people live. It doesn't matter how different their culture. It doesn't matter their background. They get this
mm,
because we all know what it's like to be rejected, some of us
mhm,
more deeply than others. And to enter into that moment when God looks at you and says, you have never lost your worth. You've always been my jewel. It's just a profound healing moment.
Well, Tessa, I can tell how healing God has been in your life. And, I do think it's extraordinary the way that you can see Jesus as a father. And I know a lot of people who experience wounds from their dad have a really hard time with loving the Father, God. Um, I had a friend tell me recently, she's like, I'm cool with Jesus the Son, I'm cool with the Spirit, but it's really hard with God the Father because she had some father wounds. And so it really is extraordinary how God has healed your heart so well in that. And so I just want to acknowledge that. I also am so grateful for the way that you get to put these stories in your fiction books. I mean, that is just like crazy itself. And that you hear people coming back and telling you things like that. Really great. I would like to ask you this, and I don't know if this is something that you would want to share, but is anyone else in your family a follower of Jesus now?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's one of the works of redemption in our lives was my dad became a Christian. My dad started because he could see there was a difference in my life. So he came to my baptism because he just wanted to know what happened to my daughter. Like, where does this peace come from? And he started going to Bible study, but he started reading the Bible, and how do you read a book from the first page? So he started reading in the Old Testament. He was like, are you serious? Do you really believe in this stuff? And I remember like a couple of times he just threw the Bible across the room and he started laughing hilariously. He said, you cannot believe this. The thing is, I knew what he felt like. I'd been there. I understood that sense of like, this is not believable. And so I was patient most of the time. I knew that the way to Jesus wasn't with argument. It was just with love and patience. And I did my best to give him that. I wasn't offended. I figured Jesus could, protect his own reputation. And eventually my father was baptized on his knees in my church. A few years later, my mother, who when I had become baptized had written me like a 6-page letter, like all tear stained. Why do you need a religion? Why do you need Jesus? She knelt in that same space and wept as she was baptized. My sister is a Christian, like her children now are Christian. In fact, my niece at 22 just gave her, like, was baptized because she had chosen to give her life to Jesus. And so we have the second generation in our family now following the Lord, giving their all to God. And that's extraordinary. So it's been a road of redemption. And because I had that healing myself from that abandonment, from that rejection, I was able to, the Lord eventually brought the most amazing guy into my life. And so now I'm married, which these are unbelievable graces. Like, how could you do that for me, Jesus? Like, where did you find this good guy? And so and that doesn't mean life is perfect. Life is hard. Life is super hard. But I also hold on to these moments of exceptional grace and mercy as I walk through the hard.
Well, your story it's unbelievable because it is the gift of God. I mean, I think that's what I always think, even when I hear stories of yours, of people who see Jesus in dreams or having people invite them into their home. It's always a constant reminder that Jesus is coming for his people. And as everyone's listening or watching us on YouTube, I just want you to remember that, like, God is faithful and he is coming for his people. And also, I know people are going to be encouraged by your family coming to know the Lord. I know that's not everyone's story, especially coming from a predominantly Muslim background, but there is hope for that for people who are praying for their loved ones. Like, don't lose hope for that, you guys. You can still, God is still on the move with that. Tessa, so grateful. I would love to hear you. I know you're a writer and you're writing, like, you're releasing books like every year. You're just putting out all this amazing stuff. But what are you reading these days? What do you like to read?
Well, I mean, I'm going to be reading Women Who Risk for sure, because that's next on my table. But I just finished a book by Julie Clausen, historical fiction. So because I write historical fiction, I also love reading historical fiction.
Yeah, I love it so much. Well, everyone, I'll put all the links, and especially for your new book coming out in November, I'll put all the links up for all of that. Tessa, thank you for coming on to share your story.
Thank you. It's been a joy and a pleasure.